Welcome back, and thank you so much for your patience. I just want to say once again, we are so happy to have you here, and we thank you so much for being here with us. I am extremely excited about our second annual Juneteenth conference, and it just means so much more knowing that it is now an official holiday. So means a lot. Loving the chat and conversation right now going on. If you haven't joined in over there, you can definitely join in. But up next, we are going to be speaking with the founder and CEO of Zimana, and that is Pierre DeBois. And Zimana is an analytics service provider that helps organizations achieve profitability improvements in marketing, web development, and within their business operations. So thank you so much for joining us, Pierre. We are looking forward to hearing you talk about when the people host their history online. Welcome.
Thank you, Brandy. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Pierre. As Brandy has mentioned, I'm Pierre DeBois. I am the founder of Zimana, and thank you also for being a little bit patient. I had a little bit of problems getting my file uploaded, but thank you, Michael, for getting us back on track. Today, we're going to talk about a little bit about marketing history towards Black consumers, and we're going to do it from a very special standpoint. We're going to start talking a little bit about Juneteenth and move forward in time, if you will, to the present, and talk about a lot of things that help form the marketing presence now, and kind of why it's important. It's part of our agency. I'll explain that along the way in the slide. So, with Michael's assistance, let's get it cracking. So thank you. So our first, just to give an overview, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the economic movements that have emerged from Juneteenth. A lot of these are things that have helped shape where we are today. And we're going to talk a lot about how that media and the consumerism that got started basically formed in some ways, it helped us to form some ways of communicating and staying in touch with each other as an African American community, and how that eventually evolved into a digital platform. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how that evolution, what that evolution really means for the Black community, particularly in this moment in time, as we're moving forward with June, not only just Juneteenth being a holiday, but also with the number of things that have happened over the last several years or so. So we'll talk a little bit about why this agency is important. Excellent. So won't go too deep into Juneteenth, but I think everyone here is pretty aware. But Juneteenth, we had in 1863, an Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and the 13th Amendment was passed by Congress on January 1st, 1865, and then ratified by required 27 states on December 6th, 1865. So there was a lot of this. But there was some delay in trying to get to announcing or sharing with people, and Texas was one of the last states, as people are pretty much well aware of. General Gordon Granger led Union soldiers to Galveston, Texas, and they announced the emancipation right there in the shores. So when you sit and hear this story, you think about Juneteenth, it was the end of slavery, and you think about what it's supposed to mean for us moving forward. Next slide. Well, the question we have to think about is, what did it lead us into? And I can tell you in one word. Next slide. Agency. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that, or it could be a definition: action or intervention, especially such as to produce a particular effect. And so what this wordy definition really means, at least for us, is that for the first time, we had an opportunity to start making some steps towards our agency, trying to control our destiny at some level. But it wasn't easy at first. For one thing, part of the reason why there was such a delay is because the Confederates, particularly the military, there was some resistance that persisted, which delayed in why the soldiers were arriving in Texas. And then you had a lot of slave owners who were doing a lot of things to try to hang on to slavery, sometimes not telling people about the Emancipation Proclamation when it occurred. In some cases, they offshored slaves towards the Western states, hoping to obscure their accountability. But one of the things that came out of it was a kickoff in the Reconstruction era, and the U.S. In doing so, it was a lot of, you talk to a lot of historians, some say it was success, some say it wasn't a success. There's a lot of debate, but it definitely was a challenging time for the United States because it was a new economic structure. You had people that had been held in bondage, now free, and there was now this, what do we do? How do we support ourselves? Some people became sharecroppers. Some people actually went back and made arrangements with the original slave owners in some instances. So, and then on top of that, you had a divisive political climate as well too. Despite the fact there were more black administrators and leaders that came out during the Reconstruction era, there were still just a lot of devices between the Democrat and Republican Party at that time. So it wasn't quite a smooth sailing at the start. Next slide. But some things did develop, and people decided that they were trying to move to different areas to get a better way of life. And so we were getting ready, and we'll talk a little bit about the Great Migration in a moment, but sharecroppers, particularly in Texas and so forth, they were trying to seek better areas to have a better way of life. And some people went to different parts of Texas. Some people actually went to Oklahoma. In fact, Oklahoma at one point had the largest number of black townships. That's what led into how Tulsa started to attract blacks who were freed. A lot of Texas was starting to, or Tulsa was trying to develop its own oil at the time, and a gentleman by the name of O.W. Gurley purchased 40 acres to establish the neighborhood that became Greenwood. And that purchase may seem we'll just purchase some land and now we're building a community, but it was more to it than that. Gurley set up a number of things that helped to start an early economy. One of the things that he did was he issued loan money to entrepreneurs, and he did that to help drive some sort of self-empowerment and something that was trying to circulate within that community. The Tulsa Star became a local newspaper, which is one of the first, not one of the first mediums. There have been newspapers before, but one of the things that was interesting was that it was focused on local news in the community and particularly about legal rights, helping people to understand what their rights were and what they weren't. So you had this gumbo, if you will, of different pieces coming together to form what we knew as Greenwood, and developed into a community home for the most affluent African Americans at the time, before, of course, the massacre in 1921. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So, but probably one of the biggest differences that helped out the Black community was the Great Migration. Roughly about just a few years, the Great Migration, just a few years before Tulsa and the Tulsa massacre, the Great Migration was starting to kick off, and there were a couple of things that were driving it. There were labor shortages in the factories that had been established in the northern states. Immigration from different parts of the world had actually dropped at that time. So there were factories that were itching and looking for people to come in and work. And of course, as I kind of alluded to with the previous slide with Tulsa, there were a lot of different places that Blacks were leaving to try to get a better way of life, and definitely they were trying to avoid a lot of the Jim Crow laws that had grown and established over the time, which limited the Black agency in the South in particular. So this led to what is probably considered the largest and most rapid massive internal movement within the U.S. history. And there's two movements, 1916 to 1940, where 1.6 million people migrated, and then the second movement, 1940 to 1970, where 5 million people migrated. And this created a number of different, inspired a number of different economy in the places where Black people were moving to because of different restrictions. but inspired a broader, not a broader creativity, if you will, in looking at services around arts, different types of services around business, and different types of services around entertainment. That started to grow and develop within the communities. It's where the blues musicians that were in Memphis and southern parts of the country started to come towards Chicago. And this is also a time, of course, during the first migration, if you notice the timing of the years, is when Harlem's influence is starting to grow and become influential, the great Harlem as we know it. So all of this led into not only where people were moving to live, and people were trying to have a better way of life. Although, as we all know, this wasn't entirely perfect. We still had residential redlining, and unfortunately, in some of the factories, had labor conflicts that occurred when some workers did not want to work with colored workers in certain factories and certain industries. Next slide. And so we had a number of communities grow in places that we really didn't have before. In the U.S. history, most times, if you were black outside, I mean, while there was blacks in the South, there were most people that were freed. If they were black and free in the North, you would have people in New York, have people in Boston, D.C., mostly towards the northeastern section of the United States. But when the Great Migration happened, we started to get people moving to different parts of the country that and different parts grew. You had Detroit with Black Bottom that was growing. You had Chicago with different neighborhoods like Bronzeville, which was considered a black metropolis, was established. You had people moving out west, Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Francisco. You had Cleveland that grew in stature, Pittsburgh. And then you also had a number of other smaller cities, Indianapolis, Kansas City, and Flint, and then my hometown, Gary, Indiana, as well, that attracted blacks into the area. Next slide. So to summarize this, I thought this was a good quote, and you may be familiar with Isabel Wilkerson. She's the author of The Warmth of Other Suns, which is the book about the migration. It's very well researched. And I thought this was a great quote that she shared with on an NPR interview. She talked about how the suburbanization and the ghettos that were created as a result of the limits of where African Americans could live in the North still exist today. And the South was forced to change, in part because they were losing such a part of their workforce through the Great Migration. So a lot of this is to say, it was a time where the economy was there were shifts in the economy, and these shifts had provided some opportunity, even though there was up to a point in terms of class and structure. But these shifts are important because they were also laying the groundwork for what we see even today, basically. Next slide. So in the process of all this moving, some things started to emerge that helped. I don't know if consumerism is the right word for it, but it gave the sort of kernels for consumerism. Because you remember, being black at that time, things were not integrated, not everywhere. One of the most famous books, the Negro Green Motors book, is a great example of how there was actually some commerce that actually developed around the situation. When the book was published, it was actually published for the first time in 1936 by Victor Hugo Green. This is when automobiles were becoming a vital means to connect to a lifestyle. People were starting to use their cars not only as a work to get back and forth to someplace practical, but maybe even to go somewhere to travel. And of course, being black at that time, you needed to know where can you go to get something to eat, to stay at a hotel, someplace where they were friendly, where they were accommodating towards black motorists. And that's what this book became. Victor Green really, in launching this, launched a cottage industry in some ways. There were similar books that appeared, and the book really did play into the appeal of giving people this sort of comfort that they can go to some place that they know that they can get a meal or get a bed for the night. And established a market for black travelers at the time. Next slide. Another key piece that was important was communication and media. And this is where local newspapers came into play. As I mentioned earlier with Tulsa, you had a newspaper that helped with legal things that were going on local in the area. But other newspapers also came into play during this time. They actually came into their height, their reach and power. Chicago Defender is a long time. At one point, was one of the most popular African American newspapers during this time. Richmond Planet for Richmond, Virginia. Miami Times. For Christian Recorder for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Pittsburgh Courier. All these papers provided vital information to Black residents, information that probably was not carried in the mainstream papers in any sort of in-depth or even at all in some instances. Next slide. So all these pieces created a class of consumerism that formed, and this is kind of a nugget that we still see today in different sports and in different ways. And I'll get to that in a moment. But again, it was the idea that it gave people an idea of who they knew that they could do, knowing somebody they can do business with for their needs, whether it's getting something for a house or some sort of minor repair or some sort of medical need. Newspapers help to centralize information, helping them to share information shared within the community. An economy of professionals developed, and these are different people ranging from maybe a mechanic or a doctor or a nurse, but you had a body of people that developed. And Blacks found entry into various industries, in a lot of cases as a result. Whether if you're in Chicago, you definitely heard of Pullman, for example, and the Pullman carriers, so people who worked with the trains and so forth. But despite all this, this had a veneer of being an agency, in the sense that while it seemed like you could do business with each other, there were still limits on where you could go. And it served a particular purpose, obviously protecting individual agency while experiencing segregation and discriminatory practices. In other words, here are the places where you can go to that are for you, but it's limited to this kernel. Next slide. So while all this was happening, we had our early tech, and I say this with quotations, basically, a transformation of materials, transformation of energy, and transformation of information. I'll get to that in a moment. But each one of these are stepping stones of progress that have encapsulated the world, that allowed people to not only have a little bit more convenience, but maybe to get certain things done faster. And if you can, ignore a little bit of the left side of the chart for a moment, if you look under the transforming energy, where you see electrical power and combustion power in particular, this is the era where a lot of this kernel of Black consumerism was starting to grow and develop out. It was the idea that you had electric power that for the first time can give you light, or maybe some sort of convenience, not quite as advanced as we are today, obviously not with a smartphone, but at least enough to be convenient and be able to have some sort of comfort. And by combustion power, automobiles were becoming much more powerful during this time, and even later on in the 40s and 50s in particular after World War II. If you're a history buff, you remember that for about 3 years, the United States did not produce any automobiles. And when it came back, cars were becoming much more powerful, and there was much more urge to drive and travel. And you definitely had African Americans coming back from the war, from World War II, that wanted to have a home, wanted to have a little bit more comfort. Those soldiers and a lot of that desire is also a factor later on with the civil rights era as well too. The idea of wanting something and still having to deal with segregation as well. So this era was also part of our early tech that was transforming society, and at some level, even though that our exposure was limited in some ways, we had enough exposure to have some access to that to help grow. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about the Great Migration. We talked about some of the Black communities that got established over that time. as the years went on, decades went on, we start forming what was called a lifestyle media. And these are this is going to be a little bit more familiar than familiar territory. These were the top news magazines that made a difference in our lives because it was talking about lifestyle and aspiration, which developed from this at some level, basically. Next slide. So many of these, and these are ones that you've heard of before. Ebony, very famous, started by John Johnson in 1945. And just again, it was inspired by Life magazine, yet supposed to be tailored to the African American lifestyle. And for years, this was a staple. I remember growing up in Gary and having Ebony. I'm pretty sure just about everybody else either had an Ebony, thought about Ebony, or knew somebody who's had it at their house. It was a staple. It was a way of not only having something that talked about Black lifestyles and Black styles and trends, but when it came to celebrities and came to people that we followed, it was a way of hearing things about them. I still even remember, in some instances, even with Michael Jackson, for example. Michael Jackson's a big favorite. I still remember growing up and having some articles that even say that this is where he wanted to actually talk and express himself because he felt connections there. There was a point where within our media like this, within our communities, the media like this allowed us to hear our famous people, hear their thoughts, their experiences, which was a big deal because they were representing, in a lot of ways, they were representing us to the larger community. The idea that who we were to a lot of people that were mainstream. They saw our community through their eyes in some way. So it just almost like this, I wouldn't say buffer or anything like that, but it definitely was a way of connection, basically. Next slide. Jet, another one as well, too. In booklet form, first published in 1951. And its byline, I didn't know this until going back and researching this, the Weekly Negro News magazine. And what was interesting about this is that Johnson actually released this specifically to highlight news quickly at the time. So again, this was a weekly, and it was part of the reason it was such a booklet was to get information out to us and get it out to us as quick as possible. It was famous for a lot of different small vignettes and content, but it was particularly famous for chronicling events from the Civil Rights era, particularly the Emmett Till's death as well. And it was sold along with Ebony in 2016 as well. Next slide. Black Enterprise. And this one was a particular favorite. Earl Graves started it back in 1970. And has grown. I think the last number I checked was 3.7 million back in 2020. And it still continues and continues amazingly with even with a small staff these days in particular. Launched, of course, it's known for launched enterprise entrepreneurship and business conferences, and extended into television. And the thing that was always informative and helpful was the top list. I always remember being an engineer at Ford, going back and trying to see if I can find the issue that would have the top Black-owned dealerships. And this was the one issue where they would list, I believe, if I remember correctly, I think I was going to say top 100, maybe I might be off. But the idea was that these were the dealerships that were representing the multi-million dollars in some communities in some instances as well. So they were trying to give recognition. But this gave a platform for Black businesses that sometimes were not always recognized in the mainstream media as easy as it should have been. Next slide. And then finally, Essence. Again, upscale Black women's magazine, started in 1970. So notice the time frame here. We've had Ebony and Jet in an earlier time, and then as we get to the 70s, we're now getting a little bit more nuanced with a magazine for business, and one that specifically spoke to that covered fashion profiles and important topics for the aspirational Black women professional. And they've gone pretty strong for a long time. They've operated the Essence Music Festival since 1994. And they've added award events And what was interesting, this was also purchased back in 2005, and it was a lot of controversy at the time. And I'll get to that a little bit in a moment, basically. But as everyone understands, these were the biggies that that have a lot of people, that has shaped a lot of people's minds, at least my mind, for a long time. Next slide. So, despite all the success that happened with Ebony and with Jet, one of the challenges was trying to get advertisers. And this was a quote from Earl Butch Graves, the son of the original founder of Black Enterprise. He gave this to J.P. Morgan Chase back in 2020. He mentioned, when I joined the company in 1988, we were having challenges with advertisers. No matter what we would tell them, the advertisers didn't believe it. At the time, we had about 500,000 subscribers, representing a large audience of upper middle class African Americans with needs and desires and investments. The reason why I picked this quote in particular is because of, and I know Johnson had mentioned this in his book as well too, and Butch's father, Earl Graves, mentioned in his book as well, the idea of how much they had to fight and convince advertisers of the fact that there is a steady audience who's interested in products and services, who deserves the respect of their dollar and their investment. And one of the challenges at that time was that there was not a lot of measurement. There was measurement, but there wasn't a lot of measurement that people could make in terms of analytics, in terms of data. Which brings me to my next slide. Brings us to this last step, and the rise of transforming information, basically the computer age. If you notice that quote referenced 1988, well, in the middle of that curve, that was actually in the middle of a time where communicating and storing information was kind of starting to get, rolling, basically. This is a big deal. It's a big deal in advertising, but it's also a big deal for us as a community for a couple of reasons. It made it easy, and I'll get to the deeper pieces of it, but it was part of this idea of making it more quantifiable in the arguments that was being made about the strength and the range and the scope of the black dollar. But the transformation came with a number of different things. It was about storing documentation as data. The digitalization of video and audio played a role in this. Then on top of those two things, you had the adoption of the internet and with broadband, which made communication faster. And then on top of that, in that gumbo, you have cloud services, which lowered costs for storing data and storing operational data. And all this combined with ever increasing and better computing, which allowed for more algorithmic programming, which is where we are today with machine learning and programmatic advertising. Next slide. So with this media and access to customers was evolving, it gave a couple of benefits and enabled information to be transported to more places, meaning that now you can have documents that, instead of driving down to the DMV, you can have something that you can download and sign electronically. It raised the speed and decisions based on the shared information. The idea that you can order something maybe from a restaurant now is through an app is unspeakable. Years ago, you had to go through the drive-through and hope that the drive-through wasn't as filled up. Today, you can order your food and get it conveniently. So this raised the decisions on the speed of decisions on what to do and what you're interested in. Broadening personal interest on personal experiences on a computer. I remember not the first computer, but the second computer I bought was a black IBM Aptiva, if I remember correctly. And part of the reason it was black, I was told by the salesman, was they wanted to make it more appealing as an appliance, so that way people can have it in the home. Today, I'm speaking to you through probably the thinnest of MacBook Pros. So having that, but you can do a lot of different things with a computer now, whether it's in terms of programming terms of listening or watching video that could be educational or something entertaining, or listening to audio, which is for maybe something for a phone call or Zoom call, if you will. So all of this had more capability to added more capability to not only to the customers but marketing, but also from an analytics standpoint, it meant that you can now, even in some cases, measure trends and have more data to do some more analysis with. So that's one of the things that's been beneficial as well too. Next slide. So where's the unique impact for the Black community from all of this? Basically, this sounds like a global thing. So how does this help or benefit us? Well, from a marketing standpoint, and sometimes from a social economic standpoint, there were a couple of things that came across that got better. For starters, purchasing trends were more noticeable to mainstream venues, and that might bolster a case for investment or for advertising opportunities. If you were trying to host a large event, for example, the fact that spending power is a little bit more measured now. You have now a better case, ideally, a better case to have investment to at least take a look at thinking about maybe working with you on your event. You have now venues for creating to sell products and services, and what I mean by venues is basically online platforms, websites, things that allow even the smallest business to offer their products and services to a broader audience potentially. For entrepreneurs, there was a path that got built from this. The idea that you have more open source software or programming languages that allows you to garner more investment in apps or solution-based software-based ventures, which is a big deal. VCs there's still a struggle going on today. Don't get me wrong, but it was definitely a big barrier from the beginning, that there was not something to allow even the smallest team to put together maybe a suitable app to build a service around. And today we have more and more people that are still knocking at the wall. And then finally, the thing that I particularly like is you have a way to connect, and in some ways it migrates some of the economic impact of some suburban flight. And I'm not saying that it corrects everything, but what it does is that if you really stop and think about it, the country we've grown in percent of population, but we're not in the same percent in every state, which means there's still some people that need to connect to other people for different resources or needs. I had a virtual assistant that I worked with for one of my data models. She was based out of Oshkosh, and we worked together. And I was floored to be able to meet her, and she was floored to meet me. And the best part about it is that we met each other online. So it kind of it helps a little bit to connect with people, particularly in the last several years as suburban flight, whether it was white flight that has hampered maybe some of the smaller cities like mine, like Gary and Flint and so forth, or if it was the black flight that happened at some point where people were moving to different parts of the country, where the black middle class was shifting. We now have a way with the internet of connecting with each other, and maybe in mitigating some of that hurt that comes out of it in some ways. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, we had a lot of different types of portals and ideas that have helped us. Websites became central portals for customers and clients, providing information for people anywhere. And they were originally meant to display just text and images. This is documentation, but they evolved into platforms with the arrival of mobile apps and cloud technology. And metrics also plays a big role in this as well too. So from the top, looking at this, coming from a static website to a website that can generate data and put it into a data layer that you can now put into a Google Analytics is a big deal. Or if it's a platform like Notion, where you can sync data between your app and your website to make it that website to make it convenient to look at your information anytime or anywhere to get your work done and get your productivity together, that's a great blessing. Next slide. The rise in the mobile phone is a big deal. Connected to people a while ago, added another means of communication to each other besides dialing on the phone, able to add text. And then as smartphones became more and more available, they added video and image capabilities that have not only helped us in terms of sharing information, but also helped us in terms of policing, as most of you probably already know. And introduced apps that encouraged more experiences from games to completing tasks as we go. Next slide. All of this comes together to make another layer of community. I particularly focus on Black Twitter because this is probably the biggest. This has been the biggest push over the last several years. But part of the reason is that we index Black consumers, Hispanic consumers index higher on mobile and in particular on some of the social media platforms. And this allowed us to create subgroups. Not just so it's not just even just Black Twitter. You can have Black Twitter who are interested in data, Black Twitter who's interested in skiing, Black Twitter that's interested in different subgroups or that you can find based off of even a subtext or interest. The word blurred, there you go. So all of this gave a unprecedented. It kind of had two effects. It gave us a way to connect with each other. Sometimes have fun, like the hashtag Ask Rachel. Gave us a way to offer our products and services, like Honeypot has, or gave another way for us to see and connect to each other, like Colin did with Jamil. But it also gave us an unprecedented exposure of Black lifestyle and issues and comments, things that probably had been regulated to the barbershops, beauty shops, and then to our Black media, the Ebony and the Jet. We now have more of a exposure in some ways, and it's kind of it's been a great thing, and it also sometimes has been a challenging thing as well too. But we'll likely see some more engagement as live chat like Twitter Spaces starts to take hold as well, or some people say Clubhouse. Next slide. And some of this has also introduced some ways of understanding sentiment. This is this slide is basically about R programming. You can do this in R programming or Python, but you can take an API of Twitter of tweets and take the tweets, place them into an object in a program, strip out like the HTML, not HTML, or HTTP and so forth, and get down to just words, and then do a lexicon and get the sentiment around maybe a particular word or a particular phrase. The benefit of this is that if you are a business, you're trying to understand your customers and how they feel about something, sometimes you get comments that are sort of iffy and you're not 100% sure. This sort of sentiment. This is an example of not only programming capability that we have that's now more available, but things that we could do with data analysis, which we could not do before, and it gives much more precision in a lot of ways. So it's a way of helping us to understand the customer sentiment and give some ideas and maybe coming up with better, again, maybe even better predictive models down the road as well. Next slide. Oh, thank you. So all this is a reflection of how we are as consumers, about how much data that has come together to help give a picture that we have a large influence, and that influence is important in not only demanding. It's more than just demanding product. It's also about demanding respect within the community as well, in a way that we've never had, going back to those earlier times. I won't go through too much of this though, but just gives a couple of quick overviews from Nielsen. Nielsen had looked at, for example, the spending power of Black women consumers. Back in 2018, they expected to go to 1.5 trillion by 2021. And again, and this is also from 2020. Online shopping has become convenient and in some ways safe. The idea that you can shop online without worrying about being harassed or followed in a store. And granted, there are pickups or what have you, but it's the idea that you can minimize some exposure to get what you need and get on with your day. Gives a convenience, gives that same sense of comfort that might be in terms of knowing where to go, who can we deal with. And then advertisers are starting to get a little bit more hip to this. I thought this last point was really good, given Butch Graves' comment. The top 20 advertisers spend on media focused on African Americans. It's increased from 3.34 billion in 2011 to 3.86 billion in 2019, almost a 16% increase. So it's brought in some interest and quantifiable, shows that we have an influence in terms of economic power. Next slide. So there's some good digital agency that comes from this. The fact that there's interest in advertising means that there's more digital ad options, which are available not only for a large business, but also for even for the smallest businesses. So even a small Black business like myself or other business owners as well could come back and actually take it and use those ads and have the same effectiveness, basically. An open source environment permits small teams to collaborate and work together. Again, finding the people that connect to us, just like back in the days of old, trying to find who can we work with. People can connect and communicate with each other's real time, who share values and interests. That's important. And then another thing about this is that it's also about encouraging corporate partners to have the right engagement. And I know that this is something that we still struggle with even today. I'll have some examples in a couple of slides, but at the same time, it's the idea that there's dollars here. We've proven that we're here, and our dollars should be respected each and every time that we either come into your store or we click on a website. And that on top of that is that we also have another piece of digital agency on top of that is exposing companies that are not investing in the community, the companies that are whitewashing, the companies that are not really thinking about us, or just giving lip service to something that they should be investing in. We're no longer having it. Next slide. And so, is there a bad side to some of the digital agency? There's a little bit, and I don't know. I use bad very lightly here because a lot of this is also about technology having a yin and a yang. So one of the yangs is that, again, because it's so broad and wide, is that you can have the ability of some predatory actors who could scale messages and scams. And these could be businesses that say that they support Black consumerism or Black lives, but they're not really about it. The ability to extend online harassment, unfortunately, has been a big deal. We've seen, I won't go through it too deeply, but I know that you're aware of that. All times too often, people are using the internet to harass when they shouldn't. Maintaining privacy data is now becoming is now a primary function. Companies have to show that if they are working with consumers in general, that they can protect the data. And then that we're definitely in that bunch. And then also a lot of the discussions is, and you've heard this earlier today, lagging diversity in tech is a big deal as well too. No one wants to share or spend dollars at a company that's not really, again, investing in diversity in their ranks, through whether it's a technology company or anything else in businesses and services. Next slide. So all of this leads to agency having much more public scrutiny of digital failure. And there's a few of these. I won't go through these too deeply, but some of these you may have heard of. Louis Vuitton, for example, having the wrong Jamaican colors on a sweater that they claimed to be inspired by the Jamaican flag. That was called out online. Last year, Snapchat, I think it was 20, I can go by maybe 2018, so I might be off because of the COVID, unfortunately. But Snapchat had to apologize for having an AR filter that showed people smiling while breaking chains. They didn't run that AR filter through their protocols, as they said, and they had to go back and apologize because the implication was not thought out. Amazon, years ago, rolling out Prime, used the algorithm that overlooked Black neighborhoods. It was an algorithm that picked up redlining clues that was incorporated into the data model. So it was training on racist assumptions, basically. Facial recognition is a big deal. Many of you may have heard of Robert Williams. This is the Black father who was falsely arrested in Detroit based off of a facial recognition that literally got it wrong. And unfortunately was arrested right in front of his daughters at his home. So this has been controversial. And then and then on top of all this, people can share bad experiences online or bad things online. Like on this tweet, this is going back to COVID. This was a racist tweet in Australia that was implying that that had some that basically had, it was a subtext that was implying that COVID racist associated with COVID in China. But what was interesting about this is that this was something that was shared on Facebook that got twisted and put onto that twisted and put onto to Twitter. So cross-platform sharing is much more often. Next slide. So what would our future agency look like with all this in mind? Well, we'll have an intersectional political agency. Politics is always the art of dealing with people, and today we are probably while we're fighting and we're moving ahead with a lot of things that are happening at state level and at government level, but the key is that it will be intersectional. And because of the fact that dialogue is happening online more frequently, means that our politics will be intersectional at some level, and we'll have to face that as we move forward. So we'll have some sort of intersect. We have to figure out where we, as a people, where we want to decide to work together and bond together. Next slide. Agency through investment. Many of you recognize Arden Hamilton. This is her back in 2019 at the Inbound Marketing Convention when she spoke. We still have ways to go with VC, but again, we've proven our marketing power. We've been really, our marketing, our commercial force has grown over the years, and it's not just really in terms of retail, but in terms of even being entrepreneurs and being pros and being much more developers. The idea that now we're looking at, we need to have more investment, and investors are opening their eyes and realizing there's more things they can do, and the more things they should do. Next slide. We have agency through digital connection. And as I mentioned before, we're using our laptops, we're using our mobile phones to connect with each other in different parts of the country and in different parts of the world. We need to take advantage of that. We're no longer in just the enclaves of where we were during the years after the Great Migration. It's our communities have broadened and they become much more digital. So we have to account for that as well. Next slide. Our agency by international connection, finding where we can talk to each other and speak to each other. And I'll say this real quick as a footnote. This is on Clubhouse. This intrigued me because Palestinians and Israelis talking for several days during the recent conflict as well. So I'm really looking forward to seeing more chat and hopefully more chat among us as well. Next slide. And then seeking the seats that secure the bag. And this means, I mentioned about corporate being much more involved. There's going to be a lot of times where a lot of our struggles are not just going to be just among us, but also dealing with corporate. The facial recognition, access to anything with machine learning is a broader, requires diversity to come, requires us to really come in and have a seat at the table. Unfortunately, there's more things that have been developing over the years. California just passed a law that talked about companies that are headquartered in California must develop a plan to have a diversified board member by set amounts. So, and they're not the only state that's done that. There's a couple more that are doing that as well too. So we have a fight, but we're coming along. Next slide. And then we need to scrutinize who speaks for us. And this is probably this wasn't my best example, but I wanted to pick something. This is on Kanye West when he was thinking that he was going to get votes, basically. And no diss on Kanye necessarily, but the idea is that because things are online, we have more voices that can come in and speak to each other. Where if you go back to the days of Ebony and Jet and so forth, our media spoke for the community. But now our community is more online, which is really us. So now we have a lot more dialogue, but it also means a lot more noise, which means you have to think about what is speaking for us, what is not. And maybe we have to think about it differently than we have in years past. Next slide. And so what should we do as entrepreneurs? Pick products and services with an eye for community needs, things that really exchange and help grow the community where possible. Exchange in active digital communities, not just the static directories. Directories are fine, but we have a chance to talk to each other. Let's take advantage of it. Create cross-functional collaborations where possible. There may be partnerships that we may be able to make with each other to help get our products and services out there. And then as consumers, what are things that we can do? Well, we can make our conscious purchases consistently, and this means actually finding more ways to find ways to do business with each other. Support local news sources where possible. And then one thing we can do is pay attention to any sort of legislation that is starting to impact development. Things like privacy laws, things like definitely voter rights for sure. But any sort of development that starts impacting how we communicate to each other and keep those ties together. And evaluate groups where support and online actions create strategic outcomes. How can we, where do we partner up? Where do we partner up where possible to help make our to keep our engagement, our shopping engagement effective. Next slide. And so I'll share this with you. One or two quick footnotes. The concept, a lot of this talks about being Black-owned businesses, and sometimes people think it's just the ownership, and it's really not just that. It's about the economic influence in the community that's central to the value that comes from that Black ownership. And so we're going to have a lot of challenges on what it is. There's small teams that can scale. We have corporate teams that come in and maybe are trying to be a good partner. Whatever it is, we have to look at that influence, because that influence must be that means that influence will be constantly examined. It won't be just the same old, same old. Next slide. And all this is just to give us a reminder that agency is up to us. And with that, I'm going to say thank you.
Thank you so much, Pierre, for that wealth of information. I don't know about anyone else, but I was just over here taking notes and writing down. Thank you so very much. And I hope that everyone was able to, like I said, jot some stuff down. And I hope it just kind of opened up eyes to more things that we need to be on the lookout for. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for being patient with me today too. So
it all worked out. So that's the important part. Everything worked out.
A special shout out to Michael.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brown. And up next, everyone, we will be hearing from Wesley Faulkner. So we're just going to take a few moments and we will be back with you shortly. Thank you so much for joining us.